Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Dill Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo. There's a smile on my face. There's a beam of sunshine coming in my room. It is Oscar morning. But before I get to my Oscar predictions, I have to wrap up my Oscars death race and sound those bells because this was the first year ever that I have watched every single nominated movie in a given year. Shorts, documentaries, animated, tech categories, above the line, everything. I've seen everything, which is a big feat, especially because this is the busiest time I've ever been with opening a new show. So it's just been quite a surreal experience to like just kind of look at this list and say, wow, I finished them all. But we do have to check them off the list first. So we have to cover them here, and then we can officially move on and say that we have completed every single one. If you were along for the ride, let me know in the comments below, and share your accomplishments as well, or just share how many you watch, because watching all these movies every year is always fun, no matter how many you watch, whether you watch all of them or not. These are the tech categories. These are the ones that only got nominated for some tech awards, so they're big films. A lot of them I've talked about on the channel before, like Guardians and Mission Impossible. You don't need to hear me go too in depth. Some of them don't require much conversation, so this is going to be a pretty short video. I'm going to start with one that was nominated for 2 awards, which is the creator is very interesting because I looked at it and it looked so good, and it does look so good, and it sounds so good, which is why it got nominated. So I was expecting this really cool, original, big sci-fi epic. The problem is, it is original, but when making something so original nowadays, you kind of borrow a lot of inspiration, and I felt like the creator borrowed so much inspiration that the originality didn't feel original anymore. Even though it is original, it didn't feel original anymore because it borrowed so many tropes from so many other things. There's also a big storyline heavily devoted to kind of humanizing this AI, showing that, like, oh, these people are people. They're not people. Let me rephrase. These AI, they're people. We should treat them with respect. We should all like get together and get along, which, like, in an overall message of diversity and inclusion, yes, it's a good message. But when you use AI specifically to make that point, especially in this day and age with the strikes and the whole thing of AI kind of taking over, and making it really hard to get jobs in the movie industry by people abusing the powers of using AI for stuff like animation and visual effects and even acting, it didn't sit well with me. And I think it's one of those things that, like, yes, it's a sci-fi film. It's not necessarily trying to be political, but I feel like all films are, in a sense, political in a way because of the time period it comes out in. You have to take your own real life experience as a movie viewer and take it into every film you watch, whether it deals directly with it or not. So the fact that I, Dylan, sitting in 2024, was watching this film with all this stuff on my brain post strike, I personally wasn't a huge fan of the whole, like, oh, we got to treat AI with respect, we got to be friends with it thing. I think there's other films that do a better job in trying to make AI a threat, a fear. Speaking of, the next film, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning, does exactly that. It's one of those films that really does show the darkness of AI and the fact that it's unpredictable and that AI is essentially the villain here. There is no actual stand-in villain. There is a villain in this film, but it is kind of encompassing a larger whole. I talked long and hard about Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. I loved it. I had so much fun with it. I think the stunts are great. I think, honestly, the technical elements in terms of like the digital CGI and all that stuff is probably my least favorite part of the film. I think the practical effects are much better than the actual like digital and visual effects. So I think it's odd that, like, this is the first time ever that this franchise is getting nominated, and I think it's for the one that looks probably the worst in terms of its visual effects than something like Fallout or Ghost Protocol or Rogue Nation. But I'm a big fan of it, so I'm very happy to see Mission Impossible get some love there in a few categories there. And now moving on to Napoleon. Napoleon gets 3 nominations, and it makes sense. Napoleon is a tech movie. It's one of those movies that you go looking for these wide sweeping battles, these pretty lavish historical reenactments and stuff. It's just not necessarily my type of film. These films have never been my type of film, and that's why when a film like this, works for me, it's so exciting. Something like Oppenheimer, which is a historical biopic, really worked for me, and it's a little different. Oppenheimer and Napoleon, obviously. One, I think, is also much more competent. Napoleon, though, it's not a total wash, but I do think Ridley Scott, he's gone so big and so grand and done so many amazing things in his career. Alien, Blade Runner, even Gladiator, if you want to put that in that boat. But then he's also had so many duds, and I feel like the duds come from just a lack of overall enthusiasm, and it's clear that he's putting detail and work into his work. I mean, it's nominated for 3 Oscars, but I just feel like there was something missing with Napoleon, even though I think it's well made. I mean, I think the cinematography is the weakest part of it, so I'm glad that wasn't nominated. But the production design, the costume design, like all that, the visual effects, even like they are good. So I get why they were nominated, though I think a lot of people expected this to be a much bigger deal than it actually was come award season. I'm glad they didn't over nominate it because I don't think it's quite on the level of many historical biopics that have been Oscar nominated. Moving on to El Conde, which is a surprising cinematography nomination. Surprising to some, I did predict it. Roll back the clip. But I think this is a really interesting film to get an Oscar nomination because it's such a film that like the Academy usually wouldn't go for in any other circumstance. It's about a Chilean dictator, Augusto Pinochet, who is portrayed in this film as a 250-year-old vampire seeking death. So you're using death as this kind of satire, vampires as this satire to show this kind of dictatorship and the story of this Chilean dictator. I personally thought it was a much more interesting concept than it was an actual executed concept. Like I didn't find it all that interesting. I found the premise interesting, but the actual execution, I was like, all right, I was getting a little bored by it. But when I was bored, I could just focus on all the great shadows and lighting and framing and cinematography because I really do think the cinematography soars so much here. It is one of the most stunning films you'll see all year. And I do think, this is a very deserved nomination. And I was very surprised to see it actually come to fruition despite predicting it. But I think when watching it, it's kind of undeniable that the cinematography is that front and center and that great. It was a great year for cinematography. And I probably would have still left it off my Pickle Awards 5, but like it's a really, really well shot film. So I totally get the praise behind it. Moving on to Golda, which was nominated for makeup. And this tells the story of Golda Meir, who is the fourth prime minister of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, played, of course, by Helen Mirren, who, has caused some controversy. Not her herself, but her casting caused some controversy. What my biggest takeaway from wasn't anything totally controversial in terms of the subject matter, but more so the fact that I don't think the makeup is that good. I think they do such a they try so hard to make her look different and kind of mask her and disguise her, but I can still tell it's Helen Mirren. But the makeup itself doesn't feel all that transformative to me in the way that something like Maestro does with Bradley Cooper, where I was like, wow, that looks like a completely different person. Where like Golda here, like I'm watching Helen Mirren in a biopic performance with a lot of makeup on, who's smoking a cigarette. Like, really, that's one of the biggest takeaways is that Golda liked to smoke cigarettes. That's like kind of the thing I'll remember Golda for. There's a lot of cigarette smoking in this movie, and there's a lot of caked on makeup, which I guess the Academy likes a lot of makeup, even though I don't think it's a lot of good makeup. So I was definitely underwhelmed by this one, both in terms of the film and, of course, the makeup itself. We got 2 films left. We got it. Next, the big one, Godzilla minus one. This was a huge juggernaut. I didn't review this on the channel because I saw it a little later than everyone else, but damn, what a good film. I mean, this feels like a film that shouldn't work as well as it does, but does because it's simple. It kind of gets to the point. It's trying to take these, very raw feelings about the war and, this Japanese, way of life and the conflict in the war and the response to the war, but also tell a really great monster movie at the same time without trying to make it convoluted, without trying to world build, without trying to go into crummy visuals. I mean, everything's kind of filmed in broad daylight. It kind of does everything right that these like US versions have done wrong, where, the US versions of Godzilla, of the past few years, the MonsterVerse, if you want to call it, I feel like sometimes the visuals make it hard to see the monsters because they're trying to like obscure it and make it, more fun with scale or whatever. But I feel like the more of the monster you see, the better. And that's why it got a visual effects nomination because you can see the monster, you can see all its scales when it kind of breathes fire, the way his spine kind of unfurls. It's so cool. But yeah, that political stuff and the actual story with adjacent to the Godzilla stuff is what makes it so special because it is telling this powerful story about this basically suicide bomber pilot who decides not to go through with it and decides to basically save his own life. But then he has to kind of go through the guilt of the war, and it becomes a larger picture, kind of this message of like whether or not it's right that someone should feel bad for living, you know? And that's the kind of thing that this film explores well, is a survivor's guilt, but not necessarily blaming the survivor for making the choice, but more so, you know, blaming the system for putting him in that position in the first place. And this is all stuff that doesn't have anything to do with the monster, but also can make sense if you make the monster a metaphor for other things. So I think it's just one of those classic, great Godzilla films that kind of really captures the spirit of the original film and what it set out to do in terms of the story it was telling, in terms of the Japanese politics it wanted to convey. It's not just trying to be there for thrills and frills, but it does still deliver the thrills and frills. So I really like Godzilla minus one. And then lastly, a film that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which I adore. I've talked about it on this channel plenty. I think it's one of the sweeter films of the year, despite having some really heavy moments, despite having some really funny moments. I think ultimately it just has a lot of heart. And it is one of those send offs that very much feels like the end of an era. And I think that's why so many of my friends are like, all right, this is the end of the MCU for me. A lot of people checked out at Endgame, and then I think the majority of the next few are checking out after Guardians 3. There's only going to be a select few that actually continue to religiously watch these films, like when they come out, the day they come out, because the culture's kind of shifted. And it's kind of cool that this is kind of a very good send off for kind of this era of superhero filmmaking, where now the biggest films of the year are Barbie and Oppenheimer. They're not superhero films anymore. But of the superhero films we got this year, I think this is one of the strongest ones, if not the strongest, next to Spider-Verse. And I think just the story of Rocket, and what they do with his backstory, it's traumatizing. It's not hard, it's not easy to watch. It's very hard to watch, but ultimately it has a great payoff. And the first time I watched it, I was a little worried that the tonal shifts were a little off. The fact that you were weeping from a character animal death one scene to the very next scene, watching Drax punch a guy off a motorcycle and having to laugh. But I think James Gunn just understands how to toe the line so finely, where any other director would have completely derailed this. I really do, because I think this script in any other director's hands is going to be a complete mess. But I think James Gunn really knew how to handle it, so where the tonal shifts happened, but rewatching it, I didn't mind it as much. I felt like it flowed better every time I watched it subsequently. So I'm a big fan of Guardians 3, and I'm glad it got some nominations, despite Marvel itself having a lot of backlash for the visual effects department. And I do join the support of the visual effects departments who are complaining and kind of speaking up about it. And the fact that it does still look this good shows that everyone really cared about it. And I think that's really all it comes down to, is care. How much you care about something really shows in its quality. So now, first off, we got to cross them off the list. There it is. They're all green. Everything is green. We have done it. We have watched every single Oscar nominated movie nominated this year. That's crazy. I've never done that before. But now let's quickly go through these tech categories, and I will tell you what I think should win, based on my own personal ranking. And then you can check out later my video coming out in just a few hours, where I will be predicting the Oscars for what I think will win. Starting with Best Cinematography, my favorite cinematography of these nominees was Poor Things. I just loved all the fisheye lenses and all the fun colors and use of shadow and light. But number two would be Oppenheimer. I still think it's a very impressive cinematography, well shot, well lit, especially the transition from black and white to color, which is something you also see in Poor Things, which is also something you see in Maestro, which is my number three. I think Maestro is stunning to look at. I think Bradley Cooper just had a great directorial vision that the cinematographer really brought to life. And then for El Conde, it's not as strong as the top three for me, but it is a very strong nominee. And then at five, just by default, even though I think it's stunning, I think the scene, especially of Robert De Niro staring at the fire in Killers of the Flower Moon, is exceptional, but it is my number five here. Moving on to film editing, number one for me is obvious. It's Oppenheimer. I think it's the best film editing of the year. Number two, Poor Things. Again, that movie flows really well. At three, I have The Holdovers, which might be a little surprising, but I really do think The Holdovers, the way it is a very small film, a very cozy film, a part of that is due to the flow and due to the energy and due to the editing. So I really do enjoy The Holdovers editing. And number four, I have Anatomy of a Fall. I just love the way they kind of make this dialogue bounce off the screen and really kind of keep you engaged in such a long period of time, even though I felt it was a little long. And then number five, I have Killers of the Flower Moon. I hate putting Killers of the Flower Moon so low on all these rankings, but it's just that's kind of how it shook out. I don't think the editing's bad. I think Thelma Schumacher is obviously one of the greats to do it. I'm a little disappointed to put her at five, but it just shows how strong of an editing category it was this year. Costume design, this is where I'm gonna put Poor Things at number one. I just think the costumes are so gorgeous, so lavish, so complex, so intricate, and so whimsical, so fun. Number two, I put Barbie. I really love the costumes in Barbie. I think the actual construction's great. The only thing is like these costumes are kind of based off of something that already exists. So like, how much credit are we giving the costume designers when Poor Things made something completely original? Though again, the costumes in Barbie are absolutely stunning. Number three, I have Killers of the Flower Moon. I think all the kind of indigenous clothing is really impressive. At four, Oppenheimer. I mean, those suits and hats are just suits and hats, but there's a lot of suits and hats, and there's also a lot of attention put to the suits and the hats. Albert Einstein's hat flying off, and Oppenheimer's kind of a little bowler hat. I don't know. I love when a film can just be kind of slick and clean like Oppenheimer there for costume design. And then at five, Napoleon. I just wasn't really blown away with Napoleon, even though I think the costumes are definitely impressive. Next, we got production design, and this is where I would personally give it to Barbie, just because I think the colors really pop in this film. I think actually constructing Barbie Land is just such an amazing feat. The scene where they're traveling to and from the real world, and they kind of sequence through all those different little mini sets, and then of course in the real world, the Mattel office I think is a really impressive piece of production design as well. So I do think Barbie is probably the best production design, even though Poor Things is a close second for me as well. Just all those amazing, whimsical kind of castles and places and cruise ships or boats or whatever. Really, really impressive. Number three, Oppenheimer. Again, all those classrooms have so much detail, so much period detail, attention to detail, and they did build a bomb essentially, not a functioning one, but they built something that looked like a bomb, which I think is impressive because that's a lot of metal. That's a lot of, a lot of work and detail needed to make that, because props are also part of the production design. For Killers of the Flower Moon, again, I love the way they kind of incorporate the indigenous culture into that production design. And at number five, I put Napoleon. Again, I like Napoleon. I think it's fine, but I just don't think it's quite on the level of the rest. Makeup and hairstyling, this is where I personally would give it, of these five, to Maestro. I think Guardians of the Galaxy should be here, just saying. Maestro, the old age makeup is so good. I know the nose has some controversy there, but I think just the old age makeup and the way they kind of make up Carrie Mulligan throughout the movie is just so brilliant. Number two, Poor Things, though. I love the whimsical kind of fantasy makeup. Three, Oppenheimer, just because, yes, he does age throughout the film, and it's, I think, so subtle that people don't realize it's a lot of makeup and hairstyling, which is sometimes the best type of nomination. At four, Society of the Snow. I mean, all the kind of scabs and withering away of the body is really gruesome, but really well done. And all those little like organs and body parts that they use to eat everyone, that is part of the hairstyling and makeup, right? Because they're making body parts out of stuff. Is that makeup? I don't know. But if it is or isn't, it's still number four. Number five is Golda, though. I think the makeup is pretty bad. I get why it got nominated, because it's a lot of makeup, but it's not a lot of good makeup in my opinion. Moving on to sound, here I put the Zone of Interest at number one. Maybe a hot take, but I think the sound is what is so integral to the Zone of Interest. At number two, I have Oppenheimer, though, because I think the big blast sound is still amazing, and there is some great sound work, especially incorporating the score into all of it, which is why I have Maestro at three. I think the actual function of the music in Maestro is so important, and that music and hearing that in Dolby Atmos for the first time. I mean, Maestro any other year would be my number one. It just so happened that Oppenheimer and Zone of Interest both also came out this year. Number four, I put Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning. I think the sound work is much better than the visual effects work in that film, and I think it's very strong. At number five, though, I have The Creator. I think The Creator is well done technically, and the sound work is great, but it's not anything totally revolutionary for me. And then finally, visual effects, where I'm putting Guardians at number one. I think the visual effects in Guardians are actually very underrated and very well done and very well utilized. At number two, I have The Creator. I do think so much of that world is built on its visual effects, that whether you like the movie or not, I just think it's a stunning use of visual effects, especially in the character animation, because that's just such a frequent thing to have to visual effect to CGI. And I think they do a really good job. Number three, I'm putting Godzilla, though. It is only the monster, but the monster is still great. Whereas the other two films, I think, have just a few more elements. I think the monster and Godzilla is still great. And number four, I'm actually going to put Napoleon. I think the visual effects, it's kind of one of those more subtle visual effects that you don't really necessarily notice, but are there and are really, really well done. And the ice scene and all that, I think is really strong. And then Mission Impossible is my number five, only because I think the practical effects are better than the visual effects in that film. I thought the visual effects, there was some obvious green screen, especially at the end with the train, when the train cars are kind of falling apart, that I thought was a little uneven, but I still really liked it. So there we go. We did it. We did it. We did it. We did it. Stay tuned. In just a few hours, I'll be giving you my Oscar predictions. Happy Oscars Day. I hope you got some good rest with this daylight savings. I hope you have a nice sunny day. And we will see you tonight for the Oscars. I will not be live for the Oscars, but I'll be here tomorrow to give you my reactions to the Oscars. So a lot of videos coming this week. So you have a lot of stuff to watch. So go back, watch all the videos that led us here to listen to me review every single movie nominated for the Oscars this year. Otherwise, Thank you so much. Have a great day, and keep smiling.